Hey everyone, welcome. Sam, do you want to start us off? People are rolling in.
Okay, perfect. Hello, welcome to today's presentation on radar aeroecology. My name is Samantha Gentry, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects that address local conservation concerns. Before today's speaker, there are a few housekeeping things to go over. Your cameras will remain off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Please type any questions you have into the chat or the Q&A section, and we will answer those at some point during or after the presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to Conservation Nebraska's YouTube page. So if you miss any part of today's presentation, would like to revisit any part, or share it with others, you will be able to find it there. Following the presentation, we will have a very brief survey that should take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps supporting programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. If anyone in attendance is interested in speaking with a conservation member regarding conservation issues in Nebraska or to find out more information about what we do, I will put the email in the chat. Today, I would like to welcome Dr. Matthew Vanden Broeke from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, who is going to speak to us about radar aeroecology. He is a professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, specializing in radar meteorology, severe weather forecasting and warnings, and radar aeroecology. He has published groundbreaking work in the application of polarimetric weather radar observations for biological applications. And now I will let him take it away.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Conservation Nebraska. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. So yeah, my expertise is in mostly severe weather, actually, so improving weather warnings. But I've always been interested in ecology from the time I was very young, and I guess yeah, radar is a good way to combine those interests. So I trained as a meteorologist. But then I found I could apply a lot of these radar concepts as well to ecology. And so that's what I'll be talking about with you today. So feel free to ask questions. Just ask questions along the way. We'll try to catch those along the way, and I can answer them. Or if not, I'll address them at the end. But mostly, I'd like to just provide some examples of how we can use weather radar data to learn more about biology. Okay, oops. Okay. So aeroecology, this is a fairly new discipline. It's a very broad discipline. It's been around for on the order of 20 years at this point. And so it's just broadly the study of organisms in the airspace. And that can be through lots of different methods. I guess the piece of it that I do is the radar side. But you can bring in ecology, knowing what should be in the airspace, atmospheric science, so what kinds of atmospheric phenomena are ongoing that could influence how birds or insects or bats behave in the airspace. Computer science, because we often bring in really large data sets, and some other things as well can be brought into this. But thinking about scale, so when we talk about aeroecology, it can range from these very small scale things in time and space. I'm sorry, I just want to verify that you can see my pointer on your screen there.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, excellent. Okay. Yep. And so the kinds of things we study with aeroecology range from these like predator-prey interactions, which can occur over seconds to minutes, usually on very small spatial scales, all the way up to migration, which can be more of a kind of a multiple times per year sort of phenomenon. And even to, I'll show you some examples of things like climate and adaptation. So how do populations change over time? And how can we relate that to things like changes in the broad scale environment of organisms in the airspace? Okay. And we can use radar as a key tool to do that. So why radar? Well, radar is always scanning the atmosphere. I'll show you a map here in a minute of where we have good data down at low levels near the ground. But we do have sampling on a really large scale by radars pretty much all the time. And so that allows us to then see what is in that airspace much of the time. So some examples of topics we might cover, well, one might just be population surveys or censusing. And so it's hard to have people out there all the time counting the number of, I don't know, geese you have migrating over, right? But we can do that with radar all the time. And there are some methods, I'll show you some examples of how we might use radar then to get population estimates of different organisms in the airspace, we call censusing. Also responses to environmental conditions. So say it's springtime, maybe it's May, and birds want to migrate north, but there are thunderstorms in their way. How do they interact with that weather condition, and what might the biological implications of that interaction be? We can study things like that very readily with radar. We can also look at things like spatial and temporal distributions of organisms. So what kinds of habitats do birds or insects tend to prefer? Do they prefer special areas during migration, areas that they can use as stopover locations? We can do things like that, looking at the density of what we're seeing on the radar. Also phenology, how do these signatures change in time? One of the examples I'll show you is a bat cave in Texas where we have radar observations over many years, actually a couple of decades now, and we can see how the timing of migration has changed actually quite a lot over those 20 some years of the record, apparently in response to maybe changing insect populations or changing climate. Okay, and so then my goals here are just to give a brief introduction of the tool we're using. So radar, what is radar? And what kinds of things can we measure using radar? We'll talk a little about kind of what is aeroecology, what are some examples of things we can do with it, and how do we do that with the things we measure with the radar. And then I'll show most of this will be just to show examples of what we have learned about biological phenomena using weather radars. Okay, so weather radar comes out of the Navy in about 1940. This was first developed, first operationalized. Radar is short for radio detection and ranging. So this is one of the first radar images that was used for weather. And so your radar is here in the center of the display. This is a thunderstorm up to the north in central Illinois. This one was tornadic at the time. This is how we first started to recognize the shapes of tornadic thunderstorms. But also at the same time here, you see this big area marked ground clutter around the radar. And so that's just other stuff in the airspace that's not weather that the radar is seeing. So that could be things on the ground like trees or buildings or vehicles, but it can also be other things in the airspace like birds and insects. And a lot of what we see around the radar, like this, is often birds and insects. So in terms of radars that we can use for weather or biological applications, well, our first national network was installed and we could start getting data in 1957. In the early 1990s, we upgraded to Doppler radar. And so now Doppler gives us the ability to detect velocity. So are things we're seeing in the airspace, are they moving toward or away from the radar? And that's really useful for biological applications. And then after that, our next big upgrade was in the early 2010s. We had our network upgraded by 2013. And this was a polarimetric upgrade where now we can detect additional things about what we're seeing in the airspace. So we can estimate things about their shape, their composition, how variable they are, things like that. And I'll show some examples. Okay. So radar then is transmitting energy out into the atmosphere. And some of that energy then is reaching things in the airspace like aircraft or thunderstorms, raindrops, or birds, and then coming back to or getting scattered back to the radar where it started. So if something comes back, you know that it was scattered by something out there in the airspace. And then you can interpret based on the characteristics of that signal that comes back to the radar, what was it that scattered that energy back to the radar? And so you have to, for this to be really useful, you have to have your energy in a narrow beam. You can't just send energy out in all directions. Our early radars did that, but it wasn't as useful. So we have a narrow beam of energy going out into the atmosphere, and it's in the microwave range of the electromagnetic spectrum. And so we're used to seeing visible light, things like infrared energy or heat. If you cook with a microwave in your kitchen, you're using microwave radiation. That's the same band that we're sending out into the atmosphere with our weather radars most of the time. And then with less energetic radiation than that, you have radio waves. So we're here in this microwave portion of the spectrum. Okay. So you are sending out that energy in this narrow beam. And so your radar is here at the center, and the energy is going out away from that radar until it intercepts something out in the airspace, when some of that energy will then return. So most of our weather radars have this beam width that's about 1 degree. So if you think about a circle, 360 degrees, that's about one degree is the size of this beam. But still, that means that the beam is getting wider as you go farther out from the radar, which can be important biologically, right? So what are you actually able to resolve in the airspace? Well, if you have two storms that are the same size, maybe one is really close to the radar here, storm one, maybe you can see it pretty well. You can resolve even specific features of it. Whereas storm two, even if it's the same size, if it's a lot farther from the radar, only fills part of the radar beam, and now you really can't learn as much about that farther away feature. So to do things with biology, we really like them to be fairly close to the radar so that we have good spatial resolution. We can really make out a lot of details about what is there in the airspace. Okay. And also, if you're trying to detect things like birds and insects, well, usually those are going to stay fairly close to the Earth's surface. And if you're using a radar for weather applications, it's good to scan vertically quite a ways up into the atmosphere. So something like a thunderstorm is a very deep feature, right? So a thunderstorm, maybe you want to know what's going on even up near the top of the thunderstorm to be able to predict hail events, severe weather coming out of these storms. And so radars, when they scan with different what are called volume coverage patterns, which are just different ways to sample the airspace around the radar. And some of these volume coverage patterns, like 11 over here on the left, they do a lot of sampling in the vertical. That's if you want a lot of detail um, about storm structure, say. But other VCPs like 32, maybe they don't scan as high into the atmosphere. They take a lot longer to scan, it turns out. They take about twice as much time, about 10 minutes. But both of these, or really any of the radar scanning strategies we have here in the United States, have this 0.5 degree beam. And so it's the lowest angle that we send energy out into the atmosphere with. And so it's a half a degree above the horizontal, which means that that radar beam stays fairly close to the Earth's surface as it goes out. Right? And so that's the kind of the elevation then that we want to look at most often to sample biological things like birds and insects that are down near the ground. So then as you go farther out from a radar, so down here on the bottom of these diagrams, this is our distance from the radar, and it increases as we go off to the right. But as these radar beams go out, they get higher and higher above the Earth's surface. And so we get to see less and less details like birds as we go farther out away from the radar. Okay. I'm actually going to skip this in the interest of time. So our radar beam typically bends down toward the surface of the Earth, but at the same time, because we live on the Earth, it's a big sphere or spheroid. Well, the surface of the Earth also bends away from that radar beam as you travel farther away. And so the radar beam ends up getting higher and higher above the Earth's surface with distance. Although there are some circumstances where you get what's called refraction, where your beam actually goes down, and maybe it even intersects the surface of the Earth at some point. So where in the vertical are you looking with your radar beam can also be important to know which or kind of what biological features you're observing. Not gonna worry about that. So here is our national radar network in the United States. And all of your yellow circles on here are where we have coverage within 4,000 feet of the ground. So we can see the low levels of the atmosphere fairly well. And this is where our birds tend to migrate, or many of them do, where insects tend to be. So here in Nebraska, you see we have really good coverage, except out in the Panhandle and maybe then in north central Nebraska. But overall, we can see a lot of detail about migrating birds and things in Nebraska, which is really good because we have the Platte River Valley, where a lot of birds tend to stay during migration, tend to stop over. We have the Missouri Valley here by Omaha, which is very good for a migration corridor also. So we're in a good place to see a lot of these things. Okay, so what do we measure with a radar then? So if we send energy out into the atmosphere, remember we now have what we call polarimetric observations. That was our most recent radar network upgrade. And so we can see things like, or we can estimate things like the horizontal and the vertical extent of things that we're seeing. Whoops, sorry. Okay, so say that you have something like a big bird flying along, right? Like a crane or a goose, something like that. Well, you can imagine in that case, the horizontal dimension of that object in the airspace is a lot larger than the vertical dimension. And so you should see a lot more return or get a lot more return back to the radar in the horizontal dimension from something like birds. And so we can compare, or something useful we can do, is compare this horizontal dimension with the vertical dimension of what we're seeing out in the airspace. And we call that differential reflectivity. And so that's really just a comparison or a difference between the two, horizontal minus vertical reflectivity. And that tells us if things we're seeing in the airspace are oriented mostly parallel to the ground or mostly perpendicular to the ground. So something like geese flying along or birds in general, usually those are oriented horizontally, right? So we can see they show up a lot differently than something like most raindrops, which are relatively spherical, or hailstones, which appear spherical. Okay. And then we have one other good tool as well called correlation coefficient. And this just looks at kind of how similar are the signals we're getting back to the radar in the horizontal and vertical polarizations. And so really the takeaway here is that we can distinguish meteorological things like raindrops from non-meteorological things like tornado debris or insects or birds, things like that. So this is just an example then from the Denver radar of a radar image. You have lots of reflectivity in here. Some of this looks like precipitation, some of it maybe not. If you're familiar with the Denver radar, you might notice this here is the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains, but you also have a lot of echo, a lot of return around the radar in here. And it's a good question. Is that meteorology? Is it like drizzle or something? Or is it non-meteorological? So then if we look at correlation coefficient, we see there's this really striking difference between these areas out here to the east of the radar that are mostly pink, kind of in yellow. That's meteorology. And then everything that's blue in here closer to the radar is not meteorological. And so the stuff near the radar then would be biological scatter. Yeah, you also have some terrain effects off to the west. But this gives us confidence then that what we're looking at is biological, and we did not have that before about 10 years ago, 10 to 15 years ago. And so with some of these tools, we can do classification of what we're seeing in the airspace. So this is just really a pretty typical, pretty random example um, from the Omaha radar. And the dark, kind of this dark color, this maroon color here, marked BI, is what has been classified as biological scatter. And so that's your birds and your insects in the airspace. And then what you have in green is rain in this case, and maybe a little bit of hail up here in red. But you can now distinguish between where the radar is seeing mostly precipitation and where it's seeing mostly biological scatter. So you can actually separate them out and get some useful biological information, even if there's a lot of precipitation around, potentially. Okay. Okay. Yeah, just an example of how you might use this in meteorology. Just really quickly, this is something I do a lot of work with. But tornado debris is something we can see very often. And so you used to see a thunderstorm. This is a supercell thunderstorm like this. And yeah, it has a shape. It looks like, well, these storms often produce a tornado when they look like this, but they often don't. So how do you know what's going on out here in this part of the storm that's circled? Well, if you look at a couple of your other new variables, especially your correlation coefficient, you see this big area of very low values. You know that's not meteorological. In this case, that's tornado debris. And so that's one way we can get confirmation that what we're seeing is tornado debris and to know a tornado is ongoing now. And we can do the same thing with biology. We can look at radar images and see where birds are flying and where insects are. So some examples. A lot of these are from locally here, from eastern Nebraska. But purple martins show up very well in radar imagery quite often. And so this is what we call a roost ring or a roost dispersal event. A lot of times in the fall especially, you'll get a lot of purple martins that will gather in a big roost overnight, a lot of times with swallows. And then in the morning, they'll disperse out in all directions away from the roost and go feed during the day and then come back in the evening. And so in the morning, you get these rings on the radar like this uh, that are purple martins dispersing. And you can see that well, this one down here is your correlation coefficient. You see this really stands out. That's not meteorological. It has very low values of correlation, so that's birds. And you can do some interesting things with this. Like if you see this signature over time, you can do censusing. You can say, well, how many individual birds are there in this particular roost? And you can track that through time. Okay. Things like snow geese. We get a lot of snow geese in Nebraska. They're starting to come back now. Today, I saw it on the North Platte radar. We're starting to get quite a few off to our west in central Nebraska. But this is what a signature from geese might look like on the radar. This is the Hastings radar in central Nebraska. A couple of winters ago, we had 250,000 mostly snow geese feeding or staying at a lake here in north central Kansas, and they would disperse up during the day into the cornfields in south central Nebraska to feed, and then return to the lake every evening. And so seeing something like this, really, you'd have no idea what this was if you didn't have some of the newer radar technology. You might think it's precipitation or I really not know what it is. But we can tell now that this is geese, and we can estimate how many geese are there. And we can look at things like where do they stay at night? Where are they going to feed during the day? How long do they do this? Maybe how does this vary depending on weather conditions? And therefore, what do the weather conditions mean in terms of the biology of migration? Things like that. So some really neat connections that can be made. Oops. Okay. And so this is another radar image from the Hastings radar in central Nebraska. This is Interstate 80 here, the red line that goes through, and after some point it follows the Platte River pretty closely. And a lot of times you get large numbers of snow geese and often cranes that will follow that river or fly along that river in the morning hours. And so you can get ground truth sometimes. If people put in eBird observations, that can be really helpful for ground truth. That's where this one came from. So tens of thousands of snow geese heading west up the Platte Valley at sunrise. And so you can see this big stream of snow geese following the Platte. And they often do that for a month or two in the springtime. But then at some point, you get dispersal to the north. And so this is an event a little bit later in the spring in correlation, where again, here's your Platte River Valley, and all these biological or plumes of biological scatterers are heading away from the Platte River and streaming north. This is all your geese and your cranes going north, right, migrating north for the spring. So you can ask questions like, well, what are the weather conditions that prompt migration in this case? If you get years with anomalous weather conditions, what might that mean for how migration plays out through that season? Okay. So polarimetry is using of weather radar polarimetry for biology. Actually started out kind of in I think an unlikely place, looking at tropical cyclones. So nothing near Nebraska. But this is Hurricane Irene. Back in 2011, when we were first testing this new radar technology. And one thing we noticed is that often if you have a hurricane, near the center of that hurricane, you'll see an area here where the scatterers are clearly not precipitation. So D here, panel D, this fourth one is your correlation coefficient. Again, correlation is very low. And differential reflectivity at the same time is very high, which means things are oriented horizontally. And so this looks like biological scatter. Well, is it? You can get reports then, ground truth reports, as this eye comes ashore, or if you're out over the open ocean from ships, and they'll say, yeah, there's a lot of birds in the eye of tropical cyclones, and sometimes insects, but mostly birds from the ocean. And so then we can use these signatures to look at the transport of birds, mostly birds, by hurricanes, by tropical cyclones. And so just as kind of a side note in this paper, one of the things we noticed, or one of the things we presented as another observation of biology using this kind of radar data was migration. And so if you're looking at a radar, this could be the Omaha radar, you'll often see these big events in the spring and the fall where lots of birds are migrating at night. So birds like to come up about sunset and fly overnight. And so you'll get these huge areas around the radar with lots of reflectivity, lots of stuff in the airspace. And you can see roughly which direction they're going. But then if you look at your correlation coefficient, you'll often see patterns. Like you'll see areas here in the radar where the values are a little bit higher than the surroundings. You'll see areas where they're a lot lower. And that doesn't necessarily correspond with what you would expect based on the direction the birds might be traveling or the direction the wind might be blowing. And so this was just kind of a side observation at the time, but it turned out to be a a really important tool. So this is some of the group that Kyle Horton's group then has done with this. So you can look at, if you know your pattern of correlation in the radar data, you can get a sense of where the head and the tail of your birds are on average. So assuming that all the birds are flying at about the same direction, where is their head, where is their tail? Therefore, you can get a flight direction, right, a heading of those birds as they fly. And then if you know your radial velocity, you can also get a wind direction out of this. And so if you know what your wind direction is, then you can determine which direction your birds are going and how they're compensating for the winds aloft. So as birds migrate, are they just drifting with the wind? Sometimes that happens. Or are they actually compensating? Maybe they want to go in a different direction than the wind is blowing. Well, they will also do that sometimes and compensate for that wind direction. And these are things I guess we expected that they occurred, but the radar observations here in recent years give us really good observational evidence of when this happens, to what degree this happens, and how this might affect migration dynamics for a lot of different species. Oops. Okay. Habitat studies have been fairly,
It looks like,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
sorry to interrupt. It looks like we have a question.
Okay.
I assume this kind of information is also used by airlines, at least as they pass through the elevation migrations are occurring in.
Hmm. Uh, to some extent, yes. And so I guess the information is mostly, so the radar information, yes, we use that to determine kind of what is the wind speed like where planes will be flying, right? It helps them. Um, in terms of the biological information, I'd say it's more just the density, not necessarily the direction they're flying, but just how dense are, say, birds in the airspace, and maybe what kind of birds are they? So if they're really big birds and high density, well, you want to be pretty careful if you're flying an aircraft, right? But as far as I'm aware, a lot of the biological information really isn't used very much in aviation at this point.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So things like habitat. Where do birds like to go? Well, they probably want to be where there's cover, where there's food. And so if you're in urban areas, especially, birds should tend to prefer areas with lots of trees, areas that aren't really urban, right? So this is some of Jeff Bueller's work primarily. He's done a lot of work like this. Um, Looking at your radar signatures and then relating that to the habitat underlying that area. And you can show pretty readily that big wooded areas or big park type areas, especially within your urban corridors, those are the areas where birds tend to prefer. During migration, this is true, but also just during non-migration times. Also, this can also include how do birds interact with their airspace? So sometimes a lot of times in the spring, if you have southerly flow up the Great Plains, you'll get, well, the air isn't just flowing north the same way everywhere. You get these convective rolls as the surface of the earth heats up during the day. Part of that air will rise because it's warm, but if it's rising in one place, it has to sink in another. So you get these nice convective rolls that develop. Well, migrating birds will preferentially go to where there's an updraft, right? Where there's rising motion, where they don't have to expend as much energy to stay aloft. And so you can often get a good sense of where these convective rolls are, where there's a lot of, say, hawks and things, a lot of birds that are taking advantage of that structure in the lower part of the atmosphere. Okay. So then something that maybe some of you have seen is you can then take some of the weather radar inputs, combine that with weather information, and then predict how much bird migration activity you can expect in the next day or so, say. So you take your radar information, you take away the precipitation, so you're just looking at biology, birds and insects, mostly birds. You estimate your migration intensity, and then you look at, well, where things are migrating now, what is the weather like there? What is the wind like? Maybe what is the temperature like? And then you can use regression trees and other forms of modeling to make a model of how are these weather conditions related to migration. You can look at your weather forecast for some future point, and knowing where things are migrating now, you can say, well, where are those things likely to go in the future? Um, what is the migration density likely to be, say, in a day from now? And so this is you can get these kind of forecasts online. They're available now in real time, pretty much. Also, things like tall buildings. Sometimes they'll shut their lights off if there's high migration density. You can predict that in advance. We've been doing that for almost 10 years now. Okay. Another study that there was a lot of coverage of has been the loss of birds, or the declining bird population over North America in the last couple of decades. So even over the last, say, decade, there has been a fairly large loss in biomass, in the amount of birds that migrate across the continent. So how do you do something like that? Well, we have a radar record that goes back for quite a long time. You can quantify how many birds are moving through the airspace around each particular radar through time, and see what your trend is over that period, in this case 10 years. And then you can do some modeling and figure out roughly how many birds does that correspond to. And over the continental US as a whole, yeah, we've seen presumably a pretty large loss in total bird biomass migrating across the continent in the spring and fall. Now, that's especially the case in the eastern US. So in the Mississippi River flyway and the Atlantic flyway, maybe not so much here in the central US, where maybe some of our waterbird populations have done pretty well. But these are powerful tools to monitor things like populations over time.
We have another question
Okay.
in the
Yes.
chat.
Yep.
It says there are NOTAM, NOTAM, called notices to air mission issued by FAA about danger to flying.
Hmm.
Migratory birds, mostly large birds, geese, location are given as NOTAM.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's good to know. So you would get that kind of information from radar observations then. That's one way at least. And so you could say where there's a lot of large organisms, birds in the airspace, and yeah, it would be good to warn pilots of that, because these can do a lot of damage if you have an impact. Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, yeah, thank you. Let's see, looking at the time. Whoops. Yes. And so this is just some theory, but we won't cover it too much. So how do you use a radar to census things? If you want to count or estimate how many birds are present in a particular phenomena or over a particular area, well, you can take your signal that's coming back from the radar, and if you can estimate something called the radar cross-section of those targets that you're looking at, you can estimate the number of birds that are present in some volume of space. And so what is that radar cross-section? Oops. Well, it's just how big the object looks to the radar, which is not necessarily the size of that object. It's also related to the wavelength that's going out from the radar. Um, but with birds, you can do some comparisons between the mass of the bird and the cross-sectional area that the radar sees. And so with fairly high certainty then, if we know what we're looking at with the radar, we can estimate the cross-section of what those birds look like, and then do censusing, actually do a count of how many are present in the airspace. And people have also done things like this experiment here on the left, where you take a bat, you tether the bat, you fly it around, and you measure its cross-section. Right? We don't really have studies like that for birds, but people have done it for bats. Okay. So some of this censusing, it's a very powerful tool. And so this is looking at your Bracken Cave down in Texas. And it's one of the big bat caves down there on at the edge of the Edwards Plateau. And so it's a cave that the Brazilian free-tailed bats have stayed in over the summer, really for a long, long period of time. You get these large radar signatures. The bats disperse every evening. They get one of those big rings as the bats disperse. And so with the radar data, then you can quantify, because you know what these are, how many bats there are every day if you want, right? And you can do that over many, many seasons. And so the data here go back into the mid-1990s. And so you can census your bats through the year. Well, yeah, back in the late 1990s, at peak, we had around 3 million bats in that cave. But you can see your cycle here in your annual cycle, where you have a lot of bats in the summertime and not very many in the wintertime. Okay? And so beyond just censusing, with this kind of data set, because it goes back a couple of decades, you can do things like changes through time. And so let's see, here on the left, we have your overwintering population. So usually Brazilian free-tailed bats will migrate south. They'll leave the continent for the winter, right? Unless conditions are fairly warm, then some will stay, and always a few stay, I guess, but they stay more often if it's warmer. And the percentage of the population that overwinters is this kind of this red line on here, showing that back in the 1990s, you most typically had only 1 or 2% of your population overwintering. And now as we go toward the mid-20 teens, it's really pretty common to get 3 to 4% of the population overwintering. So a lot more individuals are overwintering. That seems to correspond to warmer temperatures in that area. And then you can also look at things like, well, when do the bats arrive in the spring in large numbers? Well, it used to be back in the mid-1990s. If you compare that with kind of what they are closer to now, they used to be on the order of 20 days later, right? So we've moved earlier in the year by almost 20 days over that 20-year time period, which I guess 25-year time period. That's substantial, right? That's a large difference in terms of timing of migration. Things like this can be done for bird migrations too, although I'd say that's been done less than this. So sometimes down in the southern US, you get big roosts of American robins in the wintertime. So this is one of those big roosts that I happen to observe. So you can do censusing of this thing, right? So this is almost 1.8 million American robins dispersing from a neighborhood that they happen to take up residence in the winter. But interesting things then, you can quantify how many robins are in that roost through time. You can see the kind of the peak in January, and then you can see these dispersal events where a lot of birds will leave the roost, in this case in late January and then again in early March, when you have individuals leaving and going north. And if you wanted, I guess you could extend this into looking at, well, what's the meteorology behind that? Why do birds disperse when they do? That's not something we've looked at. This might seem a little bit unlikely, right? So how do we study fisheries with weather radars? But this is an interesting study I did with a student here a few years ago at UNL. They were really interested in the Red River of the North system. So up up along North Dakota and up into Canada to Lake Winnipeg. That river system there is known for these really large mayfly hatches. And so you get mayfly hatches at different locations in different years, really anywhere along here. Um, yes, this is what it looks like on their Canadian weather radar. So you get these big mayfly hatches through the area. And then you can quantify where is that mayfly hatch occurring. And in this case, this was a fisheries student. There were a lot of tagged fish, so radio tagged fish in the Red River system. And so the student looked at, well, do these fish actually go to feed where the mayflies are hatching? And so there's a pulse resource, right? It's only there for a short time. Do fish actually take advantage of that? Do they change their density of where the fish are in different years based on where the mayflies are hatching that year? And it turns out they don't very much. We might have seen some signal in some fish, but um, yeah, not so much. But you can use radar even in this way to study then almost the integrated system, the ecological system in a region sometimes. Let's see, yeah, maybe I'll. So thunderstorms during migration. If you're a bird moving north and you see a big thunderstorm in front of you, what do? Well, do you drop? Do you go around that thunderstorm? And it turns out that birds will generally avoid the areas behind thunderstorms. So if you've had a thunderstorm go over, maybe you've had this experience where you've been outside or been watching outside, a thunderstorm goes over during migration and all the birds drop out, right? And you get really crazy things in your yard because they're down now, they're not flying anymore. Well, you can see that response on weather radar, and it turns out that you can see that response less so in spring than in fall. So if you're a bird flying north in spring, you need to get north, you need to get to your breeding grounds quickly. That's much more obligatory than in fall. In fall, you're just kind of moving south, following the food resources. It's not as obligatory that you get south fast, and so you often see these kinds of signatures a lot in the fall compared to spring. I'm
This is
running up
great.
on
I'm just gonna
time.
interrupt for a second.
Okay.
Since it's 10 till the hour, I'm gonna launch the feedback survey. You can keep sharing your presentation. Um,
Okay.
but I'm just gonna launch this survey for participants to fill out. And if you can do that for our metrics, that is super helpful. Yeah, and go ahead. And I don't know if you want to if we want to open it up for questions at some point, but
Okay.
I'm just doing this survey right now. There you go.
Sure. Yep. I did have one more slide if we have a minute. And so then you're going back to your kind of the original, some of the earlier studies in this area. So looking at tropical cyclones, well, we saw a tropical cyclone or two where it looked like a lot of birds were getting transported by those systems. Well, does this happen very often, or was it just kind of a one-time thing? And so looking at 10 tropical cyclone seasons in the Atlantic Basin, 42 different tropical cyclones, actually about 40. It turned out that all of those data sets had birds near the center of the tropical cyclone. And so it really does seem that tropical cyclones transport birds very often. And I guess the biological implications of that may be significant, right? Depending on if it's migration season, say, or not. If you have birds trying to cross the Gulf and there's a hurricane there, what do? Some of them get caught up in the circulation and move back north. Some will drop and stay where they are until the storm passes. But yeah, that's an overview of how we can use radar then to study birds and insects in the airspace. It's a fairly new area. I'd say it's a growing area. There's a lot we can learn. There's still a lot of research being done in this area, but I think it's pretty exciting, some of the things we can learn about biology using radar. So yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
It looks like we do have a question in the chat. Um, says, really interesting info. What future applications of radar is coming up?
Ooh, okay. So specifically in terms of this kind of stuff, the aeroecology, I think one of our next big frontiers here is going to be um, some taxonomic refinement. So can we, instead of just saying, well, there's a lot of birds migrating today, instead, can we say, well, there's a lot of geese migrating today, or a lot of songbirds or shorebirds migrating today? And then in some cases, potentially, if we know the ecology of an area a little better, we might even be able to say, even more specific than that, what is moving in the airspace. And so I think really moving in that direction, developing algorithms that will allow us to monitor with more species level detail what we're seeing. I think that's a kind of an exciting area that's ongoing. Um, Europe is ahead of us quite a lot in this area. They've been doing monitoring in this area for a long time. And so Europe has bird radars, and so they have a lot of data sets where they can compare um, biological radar data sets with weather radar data sets and do comparisons and make algorithms and things. But they're looking at things like pest migrations. And so if you have crops that are very susceptible to certain kinds of pests, can you tell when those pests are migrating into an area? Things like that. Uh, so in terms of aeroecology, I think applications kind of in those general directions are probably the next few things.
Thank you. It looks like we have another question. Oh, someone asked if the presentation will be available for later access. Yes, it will be on Conservation Nebraska's YouTube channel in the next couple weeks. And then someone else asked, with all the talk about AI, how much could it provide for the future details you mentioned about identifying what it is that's migrating or what biologicals are showing up?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something we've all been asking about in the scientific world is, oh, what's AI going to do with all of this? Um, AI has some advantages for sure. You can look through we can analyze very large data sets in a lot of detail. You can look for patterns in really unique ways with AI. And I think that'll be the strength of it. But it's still only as good as the data we put in. All right, so unless we have good ground truth, say, to train our data sets with, things like species level or taxonomic refinement, that becomes very difficult without a lot more human input than we've had so far. And I think finding a way to do some training that involves both more detailed human input along with all these data streams, I think we're going to have both. But yes, if we can get AI um, developed more and start applying it, yes, I think it'll be very valuable to go back through our data sets that we have, especially the 20-year radar record. I think we'll be able to learn a lot that way.
Thank you. It looks like we have another question. Do you envision radar capability continuing to improve as well?
Hmm. Okay. So currently we have the polarimetric radar observations, which are you get information about horizontal and vertical. And most of the radars we have now, especially here in the United States for weather, they have to rotate, right? And so you have a dish that's sending out a narrow beam. That narrow beam is going around the radar in a circle, right? So you go around in a circle, you tilt that dish up a little bit higher, you go around in a circle again, and you just keep doing that until you've covered your whole airspace. Well, that takes, we'll say 4 to 10 minutes or 4 to 14 minutes to cover the sample volume. So if you're looking at something like uh, gulls on a lake in northern Kansas, you probably need your lowest scan to do that, and you're only going to get that every 4 to 14 minutes, right? Do you need better temporal resolution than that? I don't know. If you're if you're doing certain migration studies, maybe you do. But that is one of the things that will probably be improving or is slated for improvement in our national radar network. We were supposed to be here by now, but it wasn't funded. And it's called phased array. And so instead of having a scanning radar, one that's actually rotating or spinning, phased array is a plate. And you can steer that beam electronically instead of actually turning a radar dish. And so with phased array, you can get samples about every 1 minute. And so now you're going from 5 to 10 minutes between a scan to every minute you're getting data in. And so much better temporal resolution of biological phenomena. I think that'll be the primary thing.
Okay, and then also maybe a follow-up to that one. How much can satellites add to this sort of information?
Oh, hmm. Satellites, well, so satellites will add a lot about the atmospheric side, right, the meteorological side. So if you want to do something like migration forecasting, well, we have weather models that can do that, but they're not the same as actual observations, right? So if you have a satellite telling you, well, what are the wind conditions like, other conditions through the depth of the atmosphere, we can look at those things on a very large scale, right? Basically everywhere. We have satellite information pretty much all the time. That's really the only data set we have like that gives us wind, temperature, pressure, all that stuff, moisture through the atmosphere. And so we can build better predictive models, I guess, especially in the shorter term, by adding that extra information that satellites provide.
Okay, thank you. And then I think we have one more. Have you tried using different RFs to refine data?
Different RFs. Can you specify RFs?
The radio frequencies.
Oh, different radar wavelengths? Yeah. Um, yes, you can do this kind of thing on or using different types of or radars with different wavelengths, radio frequencies. So most of our weather radars here in the United States are S-band, which is a 10 centimeter radar. Although you can get radars that are 2 or 5 centimeter, but you can't generally see as far with those. And so if you want to do monitoring of things in high detail or high quality, usually we want the kind of the weather radar band, the 10 centimeter radars. Um, but there are also other applications for different radar bands. You can see different characteristics of different scatterer types. So some are better for insects, some are better for bigger things like birds. And so yes, like entomological radars, they study insects, and part of that's because they're using a certain frequency, a certain wavelength. Right. So most of what I've shown here has just been weather radar stuff. Right. So weather radar networks are always operational pretty much everywhere. And so it's just a nice convenient data set to be able to quantify these biological things. But yes, there are specialized radars that are made specifically for looking at things like insects, or in some cases, birds.
Thank you. Since there are no more questions, this will conclude today's presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Vanden Broeke, for the presentation, and thank you everyone for watching. If anyone has any questions later, please feel free to reach out. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you. Again, I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, thank you so much. Take care. Bye.
Okay, bye. Thank you.